Well, good morning and welcome to Maryland Department of Labor's 7th Virtual Training Institute. Please introduce yourselves in the chat and share where you are joining from. Just let us know your name and where you're joining from. So the chat is disabled, but you can introduce yourselves in the Q&A. The chat shouldn't be disabled, so let me check that.
So yes, it's only the Q&A, not the chat.
I'm also going to go ahead and launch a poll this morning that just tells us what role in your program you have. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll if you would just answer that. If you're having any technical issues, feel free to message me directly for support. I'm Betsy from Maryland Department of Labor, and we are using the webinar format of Zoom today. And so participants are automatically muted and only the cameras of the hosts and presenters can be seen. Please feel free to share any questions you have throughout the session in the Q&A section, and we'll keep a watch on that. As well, as soon as the webinar ends, a session evaluation form will pop up on the screen. So please go ahead and complete the evaluation for each webinar you attend. On behalf of our entire team, I would like you to welcome you to our first session of the conference of Maryland's Department of Labor's 7th Virtual Training Institute. This session is called What Happens After You Provide Professional Development by Ramona Kunkel from Maryland Department of Labor. So I'm going to hand it over to Ramona.
Great, thank you, Betsy. So I looked at some of the participants as you were introducing yourselves in the Q&A, and it's always nice to see some familiar names, even if I can't see your face. So thank you for attending this morning's session. And this is, again, what happens after you provide professional development. So for this morning's session, I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of this type of professional development thought process, the design, the results that we got, and the lessons that we learned. And I'm going to start off by saying that although this is mostly for instructional specialists, I am going to talk a little bit about what instructors can do like on their own. Are you seeing my slides advance, Betsy?
Only seeing your whole presentation where you're not in the present mode, so we're not seeing them advance. Let me know if you need some support.
Let me see what I need to do.
Now, okay.
Can you see it now?
Now I see the disclaimer slide. Yeah.
Okay, then I'm going to just have to go with this setup, unfortunately. And we're going to work with this. Not ideal, but it will work. So I'm going to back up just a little bit. I'm going to talk about, again, the philosophy, the design of the structure of what I did for this type of professional development, the results, and then the lessons that we learned. So before we start, we have a disclaimer. The content or opinions expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect or present the views, positions, or policies of the Maryland Department of Labor, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial products, or organizations imply an official endorsement by the Maryland Department of Labor. So as we start, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of like the overall thought process or philosophy. For most of adult education, there's been pretty structured professional development, and it tends to follow the same process. But as we move through, I think we start to realize that there is no one-size-fits-all professional development, that there are many different styles, there are many different ways in presenting professional development, and in ensuring that your professional development is effective. So I'm going to encourage you to experiment and also to just get a little creative. So one of the things that we do at the Maryland Department of Labor is, as an adult education program specialist, we are required to conduct site visits in our programs. And in those site visits, we meet with the instructional specialists. And one of the things that we have found is that there tends to not be a tremendous amount of follow-up. There may be some, but it usually is minimal, if even at all. Now, sometimes the professional development is designed that way, and that's okay. But I'm going to encourage us to think a little bit differently. So what usually happens? Participants go through the professional development. They might talk about it. Yeah, that was really good. Got some good ideas. They get credit for their attendance. That's great. They may even get paid for it. But then they tend to just go back to teaching as usual. Nothing really changes, and they rarely even think about it again. There might be some follow-up that you might see happening in your classroom observations, or even in classroom discussion, but there's really usually nothing formal about that process. So here are just some questions that you might want to ask yourself. Is, when I presented my professional development, did it accomplish what I set out for it to accomplish? Then, are the concepts that I presented being implemented? And if they are, how do I know that? What evidence do I have to support that? If not, why aren't they being implemented? Maybe they weren't of interest to the participants. Maybe the information that was presented really wasn't presented in a clear way, or maybe they just didn't understand what was being presented. Maybe they think it's important, but there are so many other things that are much more important. So the participants did not have a whole lot of buy-in into the process. And then, did the professional development make a difference to the instructor, to the class, to the students? So the design that we used, and again, this is a part of a professional development series that was offered in the fall. I did 2 of them, and Ahu Moser and Doug Weimer together, they did another professional development for ESOL. Mine was specifically for ABE. So my design was, there's a presentation, and that's exactly how it was designed, to be a presentation. Then there was some mentoring and some support. Then the participants created an activity. Then they produced that activity. And then we all gathered again to share the activities and the outcomes. So talking about the presentation, I did two of them. One was on adult learning theory, and I presented information on experiential learning theory, transformative learning theory, and project-based learning. And then what I did before I even did this presentation, I created some guiding questions that were based on Knoll's adult learning theory. Those are the questions that they used for reflection as they went through this process. And this process lasted about 5 to 6 weeks. And those were the questions that we used when we came together for our discussion. The other topic I used was rethinking motivation and goal setting. So again, I presented on motivation, what it is, what it isn't, some alternatives to motivation, and then also about goals, including different types of goal setting, and also what is needed to go beyond just goal setting for our students to be successful. Again, I created some guiding questions for them to think about as they work through this process and for when we came back. So in the first session, there was some interaction, but really mostly it was presentation, and that was by design. It was meant to present information that for some of the participants was totally new information. I also informed them of the expectations, and that's really a key piece to this whole thing. I'm going to talk a little bit more at the end. So the expectation for the participants was they would review the information that was presented, and I sent them a copy of my PowerPoint presentation. Then they were to create an activity that was relevant to the information that was presented. I asked them to reach out to me if they needed any kind of help at all. They were expected to complete their activity and then to come back so that we could all share the activities and the outcomes. Part of this process was for me to be a mentor or support. So I sent them some resources, and that included articles on the different types of learning theories. I send them articles on different types of goal setting so that they would have time to actually sit down, read the information, and think about it and how it would relate to their activity. Some participants really kind of got a little stuck and weren't really sure what to do for an activity. So I provided some suggestions, especially for the adult learning theory, and I gave them suggestions for how you could work this into a science lesson, social studies, math, reading. So if you're an instructional specialist and you do this, be prepared to come up with some suggestions or some examples so that your teachers at least have a starting point. And then participants, so they contacted me then with questions, even clarification or for input. Some would send me sort of like an outline of what their activity was, and then just look for input as to whether they were on track or if they maybe needed to, make some adjustments. So then they created their activity. And I wanted this to be something relevant and meaningful to either their class or to their learners, to their program, however it would fit in. It could be with your classroom, with tutoring, with student intake, or with support services. And this activity could go beyond the time of this structured PD activity time. So like I said, it lasted about 5 to 6 weeks. Some went beyond that 6 weeks, and that was perfectly okay. So then they produced their activity, and by produce their activity, I mean they actually, conducted their activity. So for some, it was just a one-time activity, and that was it. For others, they used multiple class meetings to work through their activity. One actually did it in 2 separate classes, and that was kind of an interesting experiment, but most just stuck to one class. But some even did an activity that reached multiple students within their program. And while they were conducting the activity, I really wanted them to reflect on the follow-up guiding questions, just to help them sort of stay on track and just have something then tangible to share when we came back. So for the adult learning theory, all types of the adult learning theory were implemented. It was great to see that there was a variety. There were instructors that were involved, tutors, and even classroom support. For rethinking motivation, some took the form of a survey, some were in-class activities, and some implemented into their intake and orientation. That included intake and assessment specialists, transition specialists, and instructors. So the point I want to make with this is that so many times when we think of PD, we think of instructors only. And I would highly encourage you to think beyond that and to include more than just your instructors, because professional development is useful for all of our staff in our programs. Then when we came back, I briefly reviewed the information that was presented in the first session, including talking through the guiding questions. And then it was meant to be active participation. So once I did that, I pretty much just sat back and just facilitated and just, made sure that somebody was presenting at some point. So it was really the participants and their time to shine and to show what they had worked on. And they also did a great job with commenting on each other's projects and asking questions and even just sharing information amongst each other. So some of the results were really varied. It was really interesting to see what the participants did with it. Some did a really large scale project, again, that really kind of encompassed multiple classes or even the whole program. And some did much smaller projects. But I have to say, they were all great activities. No 2 activities were the same. And as I mentioned, there was one instructor who did the same activity for 2 different classes, and she got very different results. So the point of this is that you could do the same professional development activity or the same activity or lesson for 2 totally different groups of people and get very different results. So if you try this and it doesn't work, maybe the first time, try it again. You might get different results. And the participants, again, just shared resources and information. So what are the lessons that we learned? Well, we learned to make clear the expectations, including completion. While those that completed did an absolutely fantastic job, and I couldn't have asked for any better participation, I didn't quite get the completion rate that I had hoped for. If you are doing this and in the course of your activity, there needs to be some substitute teachers, please make sure that you provide substitute teachers. I know that in some programs, they might do this in the form of one instructor observing another instructor, and the only time they can do that is when they are teaching. So if that happens, just make sure that you have substitute teachers available. If you're the instructional specialist, be prepared to provide guidance and answer questions. I was actually very pleased with the number of participants that reached out with questions, just even for clarification, but just be prepared for that. We recorded these professional developments, but we intentionally did not share the recording. One was for privacy reasons, and I don't want to say much more than just to say for privacy reasons. But the other reason was because this was specifically designed to be active engagement and sharing, not passive watching. Now, one could argue that you could watch these and you could get something out of it. But the whole point of this was not to just have participants, and I use participants loosely, just sitting back and watching, but it was to actually have them create an activity and then the sharing, which was probably the most important piece of this whole PD series. So we've talked a lot about what it means on the instructional specialist side, but I wanted to bring in the instructor. If you are an instructor and you go through a PD series, even if your instructional specialist does not provide this type of follow-up, it doesn't mean you can't do it on your own. You could create either a small group of instructors, or you can just do this on your own. You could then create an activity based on the local PD, or I'm going to take this even further and say, you can just do this activity just based on your own interests or your own research. Maybe there's a topic that you really have always wanted to know something more about, want to try out. You can do this on your own. Just make sure you decide what is the purpose. What are you trying to accomplish? And what do you want to learn? Probably one of the most important pieces of this is to reflect on the experience. Think about it. Really think about what you did and think about what the outcome was. And then, if appropriate, you can share the activities with the group. So, in summary, if you're instructional specialist, in a nutshell, the instructional specialist gives a presentation, then the instructors create and implement the activity, the instructors reflect on the activity, and then the instructional specialist facilitates the sharing of activities and outcomes. If you're an instructor and you want to do this totally independent, maybe the instructional specialist gives a presentation, or you can just research a topic all on your own. Then the instructor, again, creates and implements the activity, and then, again, reflect on what that activity accomplished. So that's just really bare bones, in a nutshell, how we did our state PD series that we held in the fall. So I want to thank you. And here is my contact information. If you want more information about how I did this, I am happy to work with anybody and everybody. And I would even really encourage instructors to think about doing this, because if maybe your goal is to become an instructional specialist, this might be a good way to get yourself in. And you could even take this, having done this activity, and back to your instructor specialist and ask if you could, even do a brief presentation at the next local PD. So I'm going to see if there's any. So does anybody have any?
So there are 2 questions in the chat, Ramona. Would you like to read those, or would you like me to read them?
Okay. So this sounds ideal in theory. However, I find that most of our instructors have full-time jobs elsewhere and work just for us part-time for extra money. Many are not looking to add a ton of work on top of the hard work they are already doing. All this extra work outside presentation. Are they tracked, compensated, paid for this time? Okay, if they're paid or compensated for that time, that's a local PD decision. We don't make that decision at the state level. I will tell you, I asked them now, I'm going to assume they were being honest because I asked them for honest feedback. I said, did this create a lot of additional time? And they said no. They said that it actually wasn't that hard to implement it into, because they're going to have to do lesson planning anyway. So they actually found it helpful, and it actually gave them something to work for and something to kind of keep them on track. That was the feedback that I got. Are all participants from the same program locality or different? So the ones that I did, they were all different programs. They were big programs, small programs, rural, urban. It was a complete mix. There was no, I'll say consistency as far as the type of program that participated. I can't see the questions. I don't know if you mean the guiding questions. The guiding questions that I used were ones that I gave out to the participants as part of the PD series that the PD offering that I gave. So I don't have I don't know if that's the questions that you mean. Sorry. Okay, let me see if there's.
Feel free, Dr. Scott, if you have a follow-up to that, to go ahead and ask in the Q&A.
Okay, I'm also curious about the time and logistics. You mentioned a 5 to 6 week time frame. Did that include just the 2 initial and sharing live sessions? How long did the sharing sessions last? Okay, so the first session lasted, I'll say, about 45 minutes. And then they had, so from then they had about 5 to 6 weeks to work on their project or their activity. And then the last one, I set it up to last about an hour and a half, but it really just depended upon how many of the participants came back for the sharing. We limited the participants to 15 because, just like instruction in your classroom, we did not want to overfill the class, as it were. So we limited to 15 so that when it came time to sharing, that people would have like ample time to adequately share their information. What level were the participants? What were the criteria for participant selection? The level of the participants, it was any of the staff. It was for instructors. Ideally, it was specifically the ones that I did. It was specifically for newer instructors, or for instructors that may have expressed that they wanted to have some additional support. And then what were the criteria? It was based on program selection. So we at the state did not select the participants. We left it up to the programs to submit names. As it turned out, we were able to accept everybody that submitted a name. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I see I'm at my time, and I want to be respectful of your time.
Thank you so much, Ramona, for this very practical presentation. As soon as the webinar ends, I would just like to remind you that a session evaluation form will pop up on the screen. Please complete the evaluation for each session that you attend during VTI. Thank you so much for being with us for our first session today, and we look forward to seeing you throughout the next several days. Thank you so much.